African American men and women, American Indian, Alaskan Native men and women, and Latino men face higher lifetime risk of being killed by police than do their white peers. We find that Latino women and Asia Pacific Islander men and women face lower risk of being killed by police than do their white peers. Risk is highest for black men, who at current levels of risk face about 1 in 1,000 chance of being killed by police over the life course. The average lifetime odds of being killed by police are about 1 in 2,000 for men and about 1 in 33,000 for women. Risk peaks between the ages of 20 years and 35 years for all groups. For young men of color, police use of force is among the leading causes of death. And this is according to proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States of America. So what were the results of their study? Well, this figure displays the estimates of lifetime risk of being killed by police use of force by race and sex using data from 2013 to 2018. The estimates show that over the life course, levels of risk similar to those observed between 2013 and 2018, about 50% uncertainty interval of every 100,000 men and boys in the United States will be killed by police use of force over the life course, and about 3 of every 100,000 women and girls will be killed by police over the life course. The next figure displays male age-specific rates of death by police use of force by race, ethnicity, and displays female age-specific rates being killed by police by race, ethnicity, and age. Risk for all groups peaks between ages of 20 and 35 and declines with age. This pattern is similar to the distribution of violent crime. Between the ages of 25 and 29, black men are killed by police at a rate of 2.8 and 4.1 per 100,000. American and Indian, Alaskan Native men are killed at a rate of 1.5 and 2.8 per 100,000. Alaskan Islander men are killed by police at a rate of 0.3 and 0.6 per 100,000. Latino men at a rate between 1.4 and 2.2 per 100,000, and white men at a rate between 0.9 and 1.4 per 100,000. Inequalities in risk persist throughout the life course. And then we have professional fact checkers such as Reuters.com, who go around and fact check Instagram and Facebook posts for accuracy and validity, who found that a lot of posts on social media were intentionally misleading as pertains to this subject. The graphs showing the murder of blacks and whites in the U.S. in the year 2013 broken down by race of perpetrators. While the graph itself is accurate, the way it's presented makes it misleading. Example A. The graph has a bar for whites killed by blacks with a value of 9.83, one for blacks killed by whites with a value of 0.77. One for whites killed by whites with a value of 10.22, and one for blacks killed by blacks with a value of 53.94. According to the label on the chart, these values are per 1 million members of the murderer's race. As its source, the graph cites 2013 FBI crime report, expanded homicide data table 6, as the source of this information available. According to this FBI data, of the 2,491 murders of black people reported in the United States in 2013, 2,245 perpetrators, which is 90%, were black, and 189 perpetrators, which is 7.6%, were white. Of 3,000 murders of white people, 2,509 perpetrators, which is 83%, were white, while 409 perpetrators, 13.6%, were black. Now, working backwards to reconstruct how the figures in the bar chart were calculated, Reuters found that the creator of the content assumed that the white population of the U.S. was about 245 million in 2013 and that the black population was about 42 million. The creator divided the raw numbers of the 4 different murder categories by either 245 or 42, depending on the race of the murderer, to find the per million rates used for the bar graph. By that logic, for example, only 0.77% white people out of every million would kill a black person, while 9.83 black people out of every million would kill a white person. Reuters contacted two statisticians, Regina L.Nuzzo, PhD, and Lucas Minch, PhD, from the American Statistical Association, to ask whether this bar graph accurately represents the FBI data from which it originated. The first thing and foremost that jumps out is that the data from different columns are being standardized in different ways on the same chart, said Minch, also as an assistant professor of statistics at the University of Pittsburgh. He explained that the per 1 million members of the murderer's race label at the top chart means that you're changing what you're standardizing by in each of those bar charts, which doesn't seem appropriate in this circumstance. In other words, the numbers are presented side by side as if directly comparable, but are based on different benchmarks, per million black people or per million white people. It's two different things. Because the graph labels whites killed by blacks as 9.83 per million blacks and whites killed by whites as 10.22 per million whites, it gives the impression that white people are killed by white and black people at about the same rate, which is definitely not the case when you standardize per capita, Minch said. Minch told Reuters that a more sensible way to look at the data is to compare apples to apples and then oranges to oranges. In other words, he and Nuzzo suggested to look at per capita murder rates and then look at the likelihood of being killed by someone of the same race or someone of a different race. Taking prospective population sizes into account and based on the link to 2013 census data at the bottom of the graph in the post, Nuzzo interpreted the data as follows. If you're a white person in 2013, based on the FBI data, your chances of being killed by anyone are roughly 13 in a million. If you're a black person in 2013, your chances of being killed by anyone were 62 in a million, which is almost 5 times what the odds are for a white person. If you're a white person in 2013, your chance of being murdered by another white person are approximately 11 in a million. Your chances of being murdered by a black person are 2 in a million. Meanwhile, if you're a black person in 2013, your chances of being murdered by another black person were 56 in a million, and your chances of being murdered by a white person are 5 in a million. Nuzzo also cautioned that all of these numbers were rough approximations for the sake of illustration, and that the reality is much more complicated than can be captured in either a single Facebook graph or Instagram post. Pointing to the bar labeled blacks killed by whites as what the media is hysterical about, the shared image suggests that ongoing protests across the U.S. and in cities around the world are a response to white on black homicide. This is not the case. The film Death of George Floyd, a 46-year-old black man, on May 25th has ignited global protests against police brutality, specifically the disproportionate use of lethal force against blacks. Data on fatal shootings by police in the U.S. have shown that while more white people than black people are killed by police overall, black people are killed at higher rates relative to population size. Since 2015, the Washington Post has logged every fatal shooting by an on-duty police officer in the U.S. According to the Post, although half of the people shot and killed by police are white, black Americans are shot at a disproportionate rate, being killed by police at more than twice the rate of white Americans. As was the case with George Floyd, not all instances of lethal force by police involve guns. According to mappingpoliceviolence.org, which says it sources data from 3 comprehensive and impartial crowdsourced databases on police killings, black people represented 24% of those killed by police in 2019, despite making up only 13% of the U.S. population. So the verdict is that these graphs are intentionally misleading. The numbers presented in the graph are misleading and do not accurately represent the FBI data from which they originated. This article was produced by Reuters fact check team. One way to think about it is over or under representation. All things equal, a socially constructed racial group should be subject to lethal encounters with the police at a similar rate to their proportion of the population. The figure below shows the over or under representation of the racial ethnic groups from 2015 to 2019, comparing the proportion of victims of lethal police encounters to the proportion in their respective annual U.S. population estimates. Data points that are above the 0% line indicate overrepresentation among victims of police lethal force, and data points below 0% indicate underrepresentation. Since 2015, the earliest year of data collection from this particular source, blacks have been overrepresented by around 15%, Hispanics, and Native Americans and Asians have been roughly similarly represented relative to their proportion in the U.S. population, and whites have been underrepresented by around 10%. Note, at the time of writing, data from 2019 had a larger number of unknown racial ethnic identities of victims, 20% compared to 3 to 10% in previous years. The high rate of representation for blacks is relatively stable from 2015 to 2018 and shows initial signs of increasing trends in 2019. Is this comparison right? Shouldn't we compare the percent of those killed by police to the percent of interactions with the police? Even more precise, shouldn't we compare the percent of those killed by police to those encounters that were actually life-threatening to either the police officers or to other people? There are several problems with such comparisons. First, the data doesn't exist. There are no national records on the nature of every encounter with police officers. Additionally, the definition of life-threatening encounters is subject to interpretation, and video footage by bystanders or CCTV and many instances of police use of lethal force has shown that what gets defined by officers as dangerous or life-threatening often is not. Dangerous is subjective to perception, even for police officers. Perception of danger is often tainted, if not heavily skewed, by explicit or implicit racism, views that the black body is more dangerous. For more on the long history of race and policing, please check out the website kweli.com. The articles on this site show that policing has been used to repress and control African American communities and other communities of color. Second, the assumption that police encounters with the occurrence of crime are highly correlated is problematic. Crime statistics are records of policing, not crimes. Records of reporting crimes are records of victims who contact the police. We cannot assume that existing data on crime is a full account of crime or criminal activity. For decades, there was a deliberate effort guided by formal policies that placed the focus on policing on drugs, the so-called war on drugs. These policies and policing disproportionately targeted people of color, resulting in mass incarceration, even though whites and blacks report similar rates of drug use. Racial profiling has been documented in traffic stops, aka driving while black, and stop and frisk enforcement in New York. Whites conduct disproportionate surveillance of blacks. Policing happens in a social context. It is not objective. By comparing the proportions of racial ethnic groups in the general population to the proportion of those killed by police, we take into account, without measuring directly, all the other social contexts that result in a disproportionate number of black victims of lethal force by police. The social context of the neighborhood segregation, income and wealth inequality, school resource inequality, school to prison pipeline processes, and white supremacy, colorblind racism, police apathy, disproportionate poverty, voter suppression, labor force discrimination, and so much more. So let's look at a specific example of how the level of policing does not correlate to the level of crime, but rather to the rate of the black population. In 2019, Lance Hannon and Aaron Siegel examined the police service areas of Philadelphia. In those areas where blacks make up less than 50% of the population, the correlation between police frisking people during traffic stops and violent crime rate of the area is positive, meaning that there are more attuned to the high rate of violent crime in some areas and are subsequently more likely to frisk people. We can see how that logic is reasonable for an officer to engage. See that relationship illustrated in the figure here. However, in police service areas of Philadelphia, there are more than 50% of blacks. The relationship between frisking and the rate of violence and crime disappears. Traffic stops in these areas result in police frisking the driver no matter the rate of violent crime. This relationship is evident in the figure here. The creators of this graph had this to say: one potential explanation for these trends is that police officers may not perceive differences in level of dangerous among black neighborhoods in Philadelphia. As is evident in our graphic, majority black areas tend to have higher average violent crime rates than other spaces. Yet it is also true that many predominantly black places have violent crime rates significantly below the city's average. Consider the case on the far left in panel B. It has a violent crime rate that is only 1/3 of the city's average, but a frisk rate that is 3 times that of the comparable low crime places in panel A. places that are predominantly not black. It is possible that low crime black areas end up being painted with the same brush as high crime black areas due to neighborhood level racial stereotypes. So again, this is what people like Dennis Prager won't take the time to do. When you actually look at the actual data and analyze it correctly, it's evident that the reason why there are protests and organizations going on like Black Lives Matter is because there's a disproportionate rate of police lethal force against blacks, specifically unarmed blacks, is what the outcry is about. We can look at the distribution of race and ethnicity among those that were killed by police while unarmed in a couple of different ways. The first is to look at those who were unarmed while killed within that group of victims, examine the racial and ethnic distribution. The figure here does this. Each bar represents 100% of people who were unarmed when killed by police that particular year. Each bar is then proportionally divided by race and ethnicity. In 2015, 34% of those who were unarmed when killed by police were white, 40% black, and 20% Hispanic. The percentage of whites among this group of unarmed victims increases to nearly 49% by 2019, while the portion of blacks decreases to 36% and Hispanics suggests under 15%. Again, 2019 data should be approached with caution due to the dramatic increase in victims in database with unknown race or ethnicity. Just as with the ratio of those killed to the proportion of U.S. population, while whites make up the highest percentage of those that were unarmed when killed by police, blacks remain overrepresented in the group relative to their proportion of the U.S. population. Whites and Hispanics remain underrepresented among the victims. I focus on these three racial ethnic groups because combined they account for nearly all those killed by police while unarmed. The second way to examine the distribution of race and ethnicity in relation to the police use of lethal force on those that were unarmed at the time is by looking at the proportion of those that were killed by police by race and then look at the proportion of each race that was unarmed when killed. The figure here does just that for whites, blacks, and Hispanics. Each line represents the percentage of victims of that particular race ethnicity that were unarmed when killed. So in 2015, about 15% of blacks that were killed by police were unarmed. About 11% of whites killed by police were unarmed, and a bit more than 6% of Hispanics killed by police were unarmed. In 2016 and subsequent years, there is a visible decline in the percentage of victims on each race ethnicity that were unarmed when killed by police. In 2019, the figure appears to show near equal percentages of each group being unarmed when killed by police. Counts rather than percentages show that in 2019, 9 blacks, 19 whites, 6 Hispanics were unarmed when killed by police. In 2015, 38 blacks, 32 whites, and 19 Hispanics were unarmed when killed by police. In their favor, the number of unarmed people killed by police has declined since 2015. However, with well-trained police force that was here to protect and serve, this number should be 0. While whites constitute both the highest number and percentage of those killed by police and those unarmed when killed by police, they also make up the majority of the population in the United States. Blacks are disproportionately impacted by the use of lethal force by police relative to the general population. Blacks continue to make up a disproportionate number of all those killed by police and the number of those that were unarmed when killed by police. If we look at the victims of police lethal force by race in 2019, a similar proportion of the whites, blacks, and Hispanics killed by police were unarmed when killed. While this is not the only issue that the movement of Black Lives and the Black Lives Matter focus on, it is key. Their efforts, organizing, protesting, advocating, etc., have driven some policymakers and some police departments to take note and to take some, but not enough, action to reduce the use of lethal force. While the data indicates the problem of police lethal force clearly remains racialized, there are signs that incidents of lethal force by police are decreasing for those that are unarmed. So, as you can see, according to this data, there is overwhelming evidence of racial bias in criminal justice system, in everything from policing to sentencing. Nonetheless, ongoing protests against racism and police brutality have prompted a familiar, fallacious reply from armchair statisticians in op-ed, social media, and police departments that racial bias in the use of police force is a myth, easily debunked with statistics, right? The people making this argument don't dispute the fact that people kill black people at disproportionate rates. A black person in America is roughly 3 times more likely than a white person to be killed by police. But according to this argument, the disparity is rooted in crime rates and more frequent encounters with police, not racism. In 2018, the rate of arrest for violent crime was 3.6 times higher for black people than white people. So actually, the argument goes black people are underrepresented as victims of police killings after controlling the number of encounters. Could the reaction to profile killings like those of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd be a matter of confirmation bias? Could the narrative of police racism be disproved with a tweet size calculation? No. These statisticians are consistently and excessively wrong about the use of deadly force against black people due to a mathematical phenomenon called the Simpsons paradox. The key point is that not all encounters with police are equally deadly. In any kind of encounter with the police, a black person is more likely to be killed than a white person, even if the overall rate of deaths per encounter appears lower for black people. This will happen because black people have many more interactions with the police in non-deadly situations, a dynamic exacerbated by racism, and all those extra encounters dilute the rate. Consider 2 extremes of police encounters: traffic stops and active shooter scenarios. Suppose, hypothetically, that a white suspect is killed by police in 1 out of 100,000 traffic stops and 9 out of 10 shootings. And imagine that black suspects are killed by police after 20 out of 1 million traffic stops and in 10 out of 10 active shooter incidents. In each kind of incident, black suspects are killed more often than white suspects. In aggregate, though, the percentage is higher for white people. 10 out of 100,010 white people are killed versus 30 out of 1,000,010 black people, because the white people tend to encounter the police in more grave situations. There are, of course, more than 2 types of police encounters in reality, and whether any of them involves deadly force will depend on many factors, such as whether the suspect is armed and making threats, how many officers are on the scene, and so on. The actual data is far more complex than in this simplified example, and there isn't consensus over whether clear evidence of encounter-specific racial bias exists. There are just too many variables for the data to be definitive on its own. That's why one study, frequently cited as evidence that black people are killed just as often or less often as some similar situations, has been critiqued by other researchers who noted that its approach is mathematically incapable of supporting its central claims. The inflated number of non-lethal encounters black people experience due to racial profiling could be what shifts the balance, perversely using one kind of discrimination over policing to mask another, the greater use of deadly force against blacks. Simpson's paradox predicts these counterintuitive results whenever data is averaged over inconsistent group sizes. Here, the inconsistency lies in the types of interactions black and white people have with police. Since these are distributed differently, the pooled numbers can get the story backwards.